We all know that stabbing someone to death is a horrendous act of murder. But what about sending someone else to kill in your place? Or what about using an animal to kill, so that you don't have to? Are these morally equivalent? In this video, we'll see that God distinguishes between these types of murder, and we'll also see how he expects non-Jewish Noahide courts to handle these shedders of blood. So let's get into it. In Genesis 9 verse 5, God says, "But your blood of your lives, your lifeblood, I will demand. I will require an account. From the hand of every beast will I demand it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will demand the soul of man." In this verse, God is demanding an account from the people mentioned in this verse, which means that God will hold these people accountable and exact justice from them. God begins, "But with your lifeblood I will demand," which means that if human life is taken, if lifeblood is spilled, God will demand an accounting for it. Whoever is in charge of spilling that lifeblood will be held accountable to God if they don't repent. But notice, the verse could have just stopped there. It could have just said, "Your lifeblood I will demand. Whoever kills, I will demand an account." But the verse says more, and we know that the Torah doesn't add unnecessary words. The verse then lists from whom God will demand an accounting: from the hand of every beast, from the hand of every man, and from the hand of every man's brother. Let's get into what these hands are referring to. In the Bible, hand is usually referred to something that acts, something that gets the job done. In this case, when we're talking about murder, from the hand of man refers to a classic murderer, somebody who intentionally causes an inevitable death, whether either directly or indirectly. We've already talked in a prior video that this murderer is liable to capital punishment in a Noahide court. Based on Genesis 9 verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. In the prior verse though, Genesis 9 verse 5, the one that we're going over, we learn that in addition to earthly liability in a court, God himself will also demand accountability from this murderer. So an unrepentant murderer is punished both on earth and in heaven. Now what does the phrase "from the hand of every man's brother" refer to? It refers to someone connected to the murder. Specifically, someone who sends his brother or his fellow, somebody, to kill, like a murder for hire or a mercenary. So, someone sends his brother or his friend or another person to kill. This person who kills is a classic murderer, and he is thus liable to capital punishment in a Noahide court, and he's liable to punishment before God. The person who sent him to kill, though, is only automatically liable to punishment by God, not by a Noahide court. Because a man's brother is not included in Genesis 9 verse 6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. It doesn't mention man's brother here. So the man who sends would not be automatically liable in a Noahide court. And later in this video, we'll discuss what the punishment a court should give him. But let's move on to the hand of every beast. Well, beasts don't have hands. The verse isn't talking about exacting divine retribution from an animal. An animal can't be held liable like a human can. Rather, it refers to someone who places a victim in front of a wild animal so that the wild animal then kills him. Again, this verse implies that this person who places the victim in front of an animal is liable to punishment from God. But again, since he isn't mentioned in Genesis 9 verse 6, he is not held automatically liable to capital punishment in a Noahide court. An easy way to remember all of this is in Genesis 9 verse 5, God is the one talking, and he says, "I, God, will demand." So even though a court may not punish them, I, God, will punish them. But there are a few questions about how these laws apply to us non-Jews. Let's walk through how we've arrived at these conclusions, and then with the knowledge that we learn, we'll be able to apply it to many cases. Remember, Maimonides was the chief codifier of Noahide law. He collected and organized all of the laws of the oral Torah into one compact law code. One section of this law code is called the Laws of Kings and Wars, and a couple of chapters in it goes through the laws for the non-Jews, for the Noahides. Another section in this law code is called the Laws of Murderers, where he discusses the Jewish laws of murder. In the Laws of Murderers 2 verse 2, Maimonides lists certain killers who are liable to punishment by God but not automatically liable to capital punishment in a court. Some of these killers include a person who hires a murderer to kill, a person who sends his servants to kill, and someone who binds a person before a lion or a beast, and the beast or the lion kills him. Again, Maimonides holds for these Jewish murderers, they are liable before God, but not automatically liable in a court. Now let's go to the section for the non-Jews. In the Laws of Kings 9 verse 4, Maimonides goes over the Noahide prohibition of murder. Of course, he says that a non-Jew who kills somebody is liable to death, but then he also lists other cases in which a non-Jew is also liable to death. One of these cases is starving a person to death. This is indirect murder, and we covered this in the last video. Another case that he says is liable to death is binding a person and placing him in front of a lion. Other texts read, placing a person in a lion's mouth. So this raises an obvious question. We just said that Genesis 9 verse 5 teaches that God will hold the person who places a person in front of an animal liable to punishment. But this same person is not liable to capital punishment in a court because he's not mentioned in Genesis 9 verse 6. So then why does Maimonides say that somebody who binds a person and places him in front of an animal is liable to death? The answer is that we're dealing with two different kinds of causation. Genesis 9 verse 5 and Maimonides are talking about two different cases. Maimonides is talking about a person who places a victim in front of a wild animal in such a way that he has no way of escaping. So in this case, the person binds up the victim and places him in front of the wild animal, whereby the binding up of the victim and placing him in front of the wild animal will inevitably lead to that victim's death, because the animal will be like, ooh, free food. This is probably also why other manuscripts of Maimonides' writing says placing him in the lion's mouth, because if the person is placed in a lion's mouth, the victim can't escape. And as we know, intentionally putting a person in a situation where they will inevitably die is indirect murder. This is indirect murder, and we know indirect murder is talked about in Genesis 9 verse 6. Indirect murderers are liable in a Noahide court. And this would also be considered by the hand of man in Genesis 9 verse 5, since the man's hands made it so that this person would die in the lion's mouth. And so this person would also be liable to punishment from God. But from the hand of every beast in Genesis 9 verse 5 is referring to a different case. It's referring to someone who places the victim in front of a wild animal, but this person has a way of surviving and escaping. In this case, the victim's death is not inevitable. The victim may still be able to run away or fight back, or somehow make friends with the wild animal, or otherwise escape in some other way. So if a person places a victim in front of a wild animal, but he can't escape, then his death is not inevitable. And so if he ends up dying from the wild animal, the person who placed him there wouldn't be liable for indirect murder because his death wasn't inevitable. This is the person of Genesis 9 verse 5. Even though he wouldn't be held automatically liable in a Noahide court, he's still liable to punishment from God. However, in all these cases, the court can still punish however it sees fit according to biblical justice. But with this knowledge that we now have, we can apply it to other cases. I encourage you to try to guess what the answers to these cases will be. Let's say that a person places the mouth of a venomous snake on the victim so that the snake will bite him and kill him. Is the person who placed the snake onto the victim liable in a Noahide court? The answer is yes, since the victim had no way of escaping the lethal contact. The person who placed the snake on him used the snake as a weapon. At the very least, this is considered indirect killing, but you could also probably argue that this is direct killing, direct murder, and this person is liable in court. But what if someone places the victim in the vicinity of the snake so that he can escape the snake, but the victim doesn't end up escaping and dies from the snake? Is the person who placed him in that situation liable before a court? In this case, the person would not be held automatically liable in a Noahide court. The victim's death was technically not inevitable, and so this is where Genesis 9 verse 5 comes in. We know for sure that he's liable before God. Now here's a completely different case, but with similar principles. What if the person pushes the victim into the sea in an area in which we would expect the victim to swim back to land and survive? But instead, in this case, the victim drowned. Is the person who pushed him liable before a Noahide court? The answer is no, since technically the victim was expected to be able to swim back to land. In this case, the person who pushed him would only be liable to God. A final case. What if a person places poison in front of a victim and then lies to the victim and tells him that it's a healthy drink, and then the victim drinks it and then dies? Is the person who placed the poison in front of the victim and then lied to him liable in a Noahide court? The answer is no, because placing poison and then lying does not bring about inevitable death. The victim could have chosen not to drink it or could have chosen not to believe him. So in this case, the person who placed the poison would only be held automatically liable before God. However, if the person forced the poison down the victim's throat, this is a clear example of direct murder, and he would be held automatically liable in a Noahide court, as well as the punishment before God. So hopefully we now understand the nuances here. In all of these cases, the person who in part caused these deaths is considered as a shedder of blood, all of them. And thus all of the unrepentants would be liable to God, but only some of them are held automatically liable in a court. If the death is inevitable, it is direct or indirect murder. This person is liable in a court and before God. If the death is not technically inevitable, there is still shedding blood, but the person would only be held automatically liable to God. However, the court can still punish however it sees fit. Now, with this knowledge that we've gleaned, we can better understand the person who sends his brother or another person to kill. Here's where Maimonides' list of Jewish murder laws seems to matter for non-Jews. In the laws of murder for Jews, Maimonides lists someone who sends another to kill as liable before God, but not automatically liable in court. And in the Laws of Kings and Wars 9 verse 4, when he talks about the prohibition of murder for non-Jews, he only talks about when a non-Jew is automatically liable to death in a court. And in this list, he does not list a person who sends another person to kill. This indicates that Maimonides holds that the law is the same for Jews and non-Jews for a person who sends another person to kill. Thus, this person is a shedder of blood, but only liable to God, not technically liable in court. But I don't think that we need to take Maimonides' word for it now. We can kind of understand why. Remember what we've just learned regarding inevitability, the certainty that a death will happen. When somebody sends somebody to kill, it's not inevitable that the kill will actually happen. The person that he sends still has free will. He can choose whether he actually will carry out the kill or not. Also, perhaps the way that he carries out the kill doesn't actually go through, and he's not able to carry it out. So technically, the death of the victim is not inevitable. And so this person who sends another person to kill would not be held liable for direct or indirect murder. He would only be held automatically liable to punishment from God. Of course, though, the assassin or the mercenary that he sends to kill and they actually kill, that person will be held automatically liable in a court and before God, because they actually murdered, directly or indirectly. Granted that they also didn't hire somebody else to kill or place somebody unbound in front of a lion. Now again, with this knowledge of inevitability, try to guess the result of the following case. A person gives bad advice to another person, intending that the advice would lead him into a deadly situation so that he then kills himself. The victim ends up following the bad advice and ends up killing himself. Is the person who gives the bad advice liable before a court? The answer is no, since the person could have chosen not to follow the advice. His death was not inevitable. In such a case, the person who gave the bad advice would be held automatically liable before God, but not automatically liable in a court, although, of course, the court could punish however it sees fit. But now let's actually talk about punishment. We've already kind of covered most of this, but I just want to explicitly say what Rabbi Weiner says in the Divine Code. Of course, like we've said, the direct and indirect murder are liable to capital punishment, but for the others, like the ones mentioned in Genesis 9 verse 5, while they may not be held automatically liable to capital punishment, it is still permitted for the ruling power to set up a law allowing for capital punishment in these cases for the benefit and safety of society. Similarly, if due to a special need of the time, where it's for some reason necessary to kill this shedder of blood, a court can decide to do so. And if a court decides not to put these shedders of blood to death, it is still incumbent upon the court to punish him, to discourage others from thinking that they too can get away with this killing of their enemies without punishment. And similarly, in a case where somebody sends a mercenary to kill and the mercenary ends up not being able to kill, the person who hired the killing still deserves punishment by the court. And if this person hires murderers more than once or twice, this person then becomes a pursuer of people's lives, and then the court or an individual becomes obligated to kill him at any moment in order to save their lives. This, of course, being a Noahide society. And we will cover more on pursuers in later videos. But let's now summarize. We've covered a lot. Genesis 9 verse 5 lists at least 3 shedders of blood from whom God will demand an accounting. First, someone who places a victim in front of a wild animal in such a way that the person can escape, but the animal ends up killing him. Second, the murderer himself, someone who intentionally causes a death directly or makes it so that the death is inevitable. Third, someone who sends his brother or his neighbor or somebody to kill, and that person ends up carrying out the killing. If the death is inevitable, meaning that the death will certainly happen as a result of the person's actions, then the killer is liable in court and before God. These are those cases where the victim cannot escape. If the death was intentional but not inevitable, then the person is still considered a shedder of blood and liable before God, but he is not held automatically liable to capital punishment in a Noahide court. Even so, the court is still permitted and sometimes obligated to punish him for the benefit and or safety of society. These are those cases where the person places the victim unbound in front of an animal or sends another person to kill. The killer would be held automatically liable, but not necessarily the sender. Remember that God expects all non-Jewish societies to follow these laws, and he expects every non-Jewish legal system to implement these laws if the majority of society recognize him as the one true God and accepts upon themselves these laws as divine, given from God. On this channel, we go through all of the Noahide laws, which are the laws of the future. So subscribe so you learn about God's will and what God wants us to do. Again, this is the future. Thank you, as always, for watching.